Good evening. I'm Mary Madden, the Director of the Museum and Education Division for the Kansas State Historical Society. Thank you for joining us for our monthly virtual Museum After Hours program, coming to you from the Kansas Museum of History. As always, the program will be followed by a question and answer period with our presenter. Please use the Q&A link at the bottom of the screen to post your questions, and we'll get to as many as we can. At last count, we had about 200 registrants for this program, which is fantastic. We hope we have made it clear on the registration page that we are only able to host 100 users in the website itself, the webinars website itself. For everyone else, you can live stream the program using our website, kshs.org, and our YouTube channel, and it will live stream it. I sincerely hope we are able to accommodate everyone wishing to attend. I am pleased to welcome Dr. Jane Johansson to deliver tonight's presentation. Dr. Johansson is a native Oklahoman, received a doctorate in U.S. history from the University of North Texas, and currently teaches at Rogers State University in Oklahoma. Johansson is the author of 3 books about the Civil War west of the Mississippi River. Her most recent book, which is our program this evening, is Albert C. Ellithorpe, The First Indian Home Guards and the Civil War on the Trans-Mississippi Frontier. It received the Founders Award from the American Civil War Museum in recognition of excellence in the editing of primary source documents. Dr. Johansson will address the regiment's unusual history. Recruited in Kansas refugee camps in the spring of 1862, the 1st Indian Home Guard was a unique Civil War regiment. Comprised of whites, refugee Muscogee Creeks and Seminoles, and African Creeks, the regiment served in a variety of military operations from 1862 to 1865. Dr. Johansson will explore the regimental background, its composition, notable personalities, military actions, relations with the federal government, and the post-war era. She will also teach us, as she just taught me, how to correctly pronounce the name of a very important Muscogee Creek Indian chief and Union supporter. Okay, I'm going to hope to get this right. Opali'iholo. Okay, take it away. Welcome, Dr. Johansson.
Thank you very much. It's wonderful to be here. First of all, a technical issue. I don't see my PowerPoint. Let me get to that. Here we go. Can you see that?
Great.
Thank you. Well, it's wonderful to be here tonight. I know there are a lot of you out there, and it is kind of an odd feeling to be presenting a talk to a large group of people and yet not really be able to see you. But that's just the way it has to be. So I'm glad that we're able to do this format. The 1st Indian Home Guards were a regiment of refugees that fought, died, and were wounded at melodious sounding places: Old Fort Wayne, Camp Babcock, Prairie Grove, Fort Blunt, Honey Springs, Greenleaf Prairie, the Creek Agency, Cabin Creek. Most of their names were multisyllabic and difficult for white people to say. Now, I want to make it clear up front, I'm not a native speaker, so I hope that I'm pronouncing these names at least pretty close to accurate. Their names were written phonetically on the muster rolls. Here's a part of one muster roll. The names included men such as Okaniyahola, Yanokin, Chipla, and then you can see others that are on this list. You'll notice some of these men were recruited in Kansas. The purpose of this talk is to focus on what Mary stated was a unique military unit. They did serve in a relatively forgotten part of the Civil War, and I will attempt to answer questions such as why was this unit created? What did it do during the Civil War? What kind of men served in it? And how were they treated? When the Civil War started in 1861, the Indian Territory was drought-stricken, and it was the scene of a surprising amount of activity at the beginning of the war. When the war started, there was a population of about 60,000 in the Indian Territory. Most of these were members of the 5 tribes: the Cherokee, the Chickasaw, the Choctaw, the Muscogee Creek, and the Seminole. These peoples had been in the Indian Territory for about 25 years. And of course, that was due to their forced removal from the southeastern part of the United States. When the Civil War started, the Lincoln administration pulled out federal troops from the Indian Territory and dispatched them to other areas. The Confederacy acted with great decisiveness at that point. They actually sent a Confederate diplomat into the territory. And that diplomat was this gentleman, Albert Pike. He negotiated treaties of alliance with each of the 5 tribes. Now, not all of the native peoples, though, were supportive of these alliances with the Confederacy, and that's a topic for really a whole nother presentation. But one of the Indian leaders who was opposed to this alliance with the Confederacy was a very aged and venerable Muscogee Creek named Opatli-Oholo. Occasionally you'll hear it pronounced a little bit differently than that. But he led a group of loyal Muscogee Creeks, loyal to the federal government, some African Creeks who were enslaved, and various other native peoples. They were actually driven out of the Indian Territory in a series of military engagements that occurred in November and December of 1861. These refugees entered southern Kansas, and they camped in an area primarily along the Verdigris River. Now, this obviously is a modern map, but the Verdigris River is kind of down in the southwest corner of this map. So these native people set up camps in that area, as well as some camps along some creeks in the area. The conditions in these camps were horrible. The winter was extremely severe, and many of these peoples were lacking shoes. They had inadequate clothing. It's estimated that about 10% of them died that winter. Now, there were groups that tried to assist them, and that included private charity groups. The United States Army aided as well, and also Indian agents. In the springtime, these refugees were moved over to the area near, now I'm not from Kansas, I might be messing this up, the town of Leroy, or perhaps it's pronounced Leroy, I'm not sure. But the camps were moved there because there were about 200 horse carcasses near the old camps, and they obviously posed a health threat. In these new camps, that's where the recruitment of the Indian Home Guard units began. The Lincoln administration, of course, was looking around for soldiers that they could recruit. And the Lincoln administration had a goal of recruiting 4,000 Native Americans into Indian Home Guards units. The idea was that these soldiers could move back into the Indian Territory, hopefully remove Confederate forces from there, and then that would allow the refugees to return to their homes. And then these Indian Home Guards units would be there as a defensive force. This plan stalled out temporarily in the spring of 1862 when Cherokee Confederate soldiers allegedly scalped Union soldiers at the Battle of Pea Ridge. But the Lincoln administration needed soldiers again. And so after a period of a few weeks, efforts at recruitment picked up again. Also, keep in mind the Confederacy had already organized Indian units. The US Army had long used Indian scouts, but this would be the first time in American history that the US Army would actually put together standalone Indian units. The first Indian Home Guards was mustered into service on May the 22nd of 1862 with 1,008 men organized into 10 companies. And by the way, from this point on, I'm just going to use the term unit and regiment interchangeably. And here's just a little chart that shows the basic organization of Civil War armies. Regiments were really the building block of these armies. So here we have, for example, in this first box, an infantry regiment was made up of 10 companies. On paper, they would have 100 men each. So you'd have a total of about 1,000 men in an infantry regiment. Those numbers were rarely achieved. There were always men who were sick. Maybe they had been detached. Maybe they were on leave. So for various reasons, they normally were not at full strength. And then this chart also explains that regiments would be put into brigades, brigades into divisions, and so on. The first Indian Home Guards, again, had 10 companies. 8 of those were made up primarily of Muscogee Creek Indians, many of them full blood. The other 2 companies were made up primarily of Seminoles. By the end of the war, their composition had changed. By the end of the war, about 20% of the regiment was made up of Cherokees. Who were these men? Well, according to Albert Ellithorpe, who was one of the white officers in the regiment, he's someone I'll mention more a bit later on. But in an article he wrote for a Chicago newspaper, he said that most of the men had been, quote, farmers and heavy stock raisers. He went on to write that they are educated in their own language. They have books printed in the Creek tongue and in a very neat style. Their schools are conducted in good order. This was a tri-racial regiment. All of the top commissioned officer positions were filled by Caucasians. Here is the man who was the regiment's first commanding officer. Colonel Robert Furness was from Brownsville in the Nebraska Territory, and he had primarily worked as a newspaper man. The regiment's second in command, the lieutenant colonel, was Stephen Waddles. I have never been able to locate a photograph of him. He was also from Brownsville, Nebraska. The major, he was a very interesting fellow, William G. Phillips. He was born in Scotland. He immigrated to the Kansas Territory in the 1850s. And like Furness, he was also a newspaper man. He would be associated with the Indian Home Guard units for the rest of the war. At the end of 1862, there would be 3 Indian Guard units. They would be put together into a brigade, and he would become their brigade commander. Here's Albert Ellithorpe, who would serve as the regiment's adjutant, and he would later be promoted to major. And you'll notice this image is from the Kansas Historical Society and is part of the Ellithorpe family papers, which I made use of and was very appreciative of their availability. The enlisted men in Civil War regiments typically elected their own officers. So the enlisted men in the 1st Indian Home Guards elected 31 Indians to be their commissioned officers. All of the captains were Native Americans, and several of them served for the entire war in that capacity. And here's a nice engraving of one of the captains, Nico Hutka. He served as a captain in this regiment for the entire war. It was actually very important that Native Americans fill many of the commissioned officer slots because many of the enlisted men did not know English. And so it was important that Indian officers not only be conversant in their native tongue, but also in English. However, it was discovered that none of the Indian first lieutenants knew English, and so they were all forced to resign their commissions and were replaced with Caucasians. One of the problems with them not knowing English is that first lieutenants had a great deal of paperwork to do, and it was essential that they knew English. Now, again, this was a tri-racial unit. So now we get to the next group. There were 25 to 30 men who were African Creeks. These were men who had been enslaved in the Indian Territory. Now, of course, once they joined the 1st Indian Home Guards, they were no longer enslaved. They had their freedom at this point. The 25 to 30 African Creeks in the 1st Indian Home Guards were just quietly mustered in. They would be the very first African Americans to serve in the US Army during the Civil War. On the muster rolls, they are labeled in various ways. The labels are African, another label is Black, and another one is yellow. Many of these men were of mixed race. And here you see one of them, Silas Jefferson. You see his Muscogee Creek name on there too. This is a post-war image of Silas Jefferson. The African Creeks did serve as, regular soldiers in this unit, but they also filled a very critical role as interpreters. And that is the role they had played when they were enslaved. So they were really kind of a bridge between the Indian world and the white world. The 1st Indian Home Guards was really intended to be a mounted unit. Army officials wanted units with a great deal of mobility in the West. And some of the men who initially served in this regiment had brought horses with them when they had fled the Indian Territory. But in spite of this, when they started campaigning in the summer of 1862, only about a third of the men were mounted. So, what about the rest of the regiment? Well, some of them walked, I should say marched, during their first campaign, and others were put into wagons. I heard Ed Bars. Ed Bars was a very significant Civil War historian who passed away recently. I heard him say once that these wagons were kind of like the first personnel troop carriers. This unit then had a mounted part and a dismounted part during their first campaign. Actually, though, this regiment throughout their service was a very versatile one. And they operated periodically as infantry and again periodically as a mounted unit. Sometimes I have people who are curious about the uniforms that these Indian soldiers wore. Their uniforms were very similar to those of other Union soldiers. Here's one example. Here's a soldier who served in the 1st Indian Home Guards. And you can see his uniform. What most Native soldiers did is they would often kind of personalize their uniforms in some way. So here we have John Chupko, and he has a feather in his hat. And you'll also notice on his hat are crossed sabers, which is a designation for a mounted unit. And then it also looks like he is wearing some sort of scarf around his neck. Perhaps it's the color red, I'm not really sure. And then this photograph, many of you have probably seen this before. This is an image that is often reproduced. We do not know the identity of this soldier, so have no idea which particular unit he served in. But you can see he too has personalized his uniform with a feather in his hat. And then he has all the rest, though, are regulation equipment, a Model 1860 saber, Remington 44 revolver, and so on. There were some Union Indian soldiers who wore crossed pins on their uniforms and thus getting the designation pin Indians. The use of the crossed pins apparently started in the secret Cherokee Kituwa Society. And eventually the cross pins came to symbolize all Union Indian soldiers. Some of the men in the 1st Indian Home Guards were issued a Model 1817 musket. It actually was often nicknamed the Indian rifle. It had originally been a flintlock rifle, but had been converted to use percussion caps. It weighed a little over 10 pounds. It fired a round ball, and as you might guess, was quite effective at close range. Later in the war, though, they would be issued more modern weapons. In the spring of 1862, the 2nd Indian Home Guards was organized, and the 3rd Indian Home Guards was partly organized. Both the 2nd and the 3rd were made up primarily of Cherokees. When I do research, I will occasionally come across very interesting observations from white soldiers who observed the men in the Indian Home Guard units. There were a number of white soldiers who had never seen a Native American before. And I'll share with you a couple of quotes from a man named Chester Barney. He served as a captain in the 20th Iowa Infantry. He witnessed one of the Indian regiments passing by in the night. He wrote that they were mounted, but that some of the horses had, quote, neither saddle nor bridle. The warriors painted, their waist bare. On another occasion, he observed that many Indian soldiers were, quote, well clothed, but some, he said, had a profuse covering of paint, which was put on for the double purpose of ornament and to designate the tribe to which they belonged. He also saw a fine, athletic fellow who had a spur fastened on his heel by a piece of rope and a small bell hanging to his nose. Again, these native soldiers were often seen as exotic by white soldiers. Where did the first Indian Home Guards serve? Well, hopefully this map will help describe that. This is the so-called border region. And this was an area that would have been, most of this area would have been quite familiar to the first Indian Home Guards during their Civil War service. Most of their campaigning occurred in kind of a rough rectangle, and not sure I can show you very easily, but basically much of Northeast Indian Territory into Southeast Kansas, over into Southwest Missouri, and down into Northwest Arkansas. If you actually measure that out, that little rectangle that I've traced here is about 190 miles north-south and about 100 miles east-west. Just as a matter of comparison, it's about 85 miles between Richmond, Virginia, and Washington, D.C. That's the area that was so fought over in the Eastern Theater. So you can see the Indian Home Guard units certainly traversed a much wider geographical region. The first Indian Home Guards would serve during the Civil War with Caucasian units on occasion. They also served pretty closely with the 1st Kansas Colored Infantry at times. But for much of the war, the Indian Home Guard units would be brigaded together and would serve as a group. Now, it would be, frankly, very tedious if I were to document each of their military actions. So I'm going to talk about those in really more of a thematic way. And I'm going to use the writings of Albert Ellithorpe as kind of a vehicle to describe some of these military actions. Their first military campaign is one that is known as the First Indian Expedition. And I've kind of blown up a little section here of a border region map. Really, in this campaign, which was in the summer of 1862, the first Indian Home Guards acted more like some sort of strike force. The expedition entered the Indian Territory. It was made up of the Indian Home Guard units that had organized at that point, plus some Caucasian units. And the whole purpose of the first Indian expedition was to dislodge Confederate forces so that the refugees could be resettled, could go back to their homes, and then the Indian Home Guard units could act as a defensive force. They entered the Indian Territory and traveled down primarily the Grand River. As they were traveling into the territory, they received word that there was a Confederate force camped at Locust Grove. Locust Grove is north and a little bit east of Fort Gibson, not far from the Grand River. This Confederate force was relatively small, made up of about 300 men or so. They were mostly men from a Missouri regiment, though there were some men there from another unit too. The men from the 1st Indian Home Guards were part of the strike force that struck the Locust Grove camp. There were also Caucasians from one of the Kansas cavalry regiments too, who joined in as well. The men traveled down the west bank of the Grand River. As they came to various cabins, they basically detained any civilians that were in those cabins, and they detained them until after the strike force, after the raid was complete. They splashed across the Grand River about 4 a.m. And when they attacked the Confederate encampment, according to one observer, the bright stars were still shining in the sky. And this was on the morning of July the 3rd of 1862. It was a complete surprise. Confederate soldiers had no idea that there was a Union force in the area. Many of the Confederate soldiers were sleeping without their trousers on because it was a very hot night. One of the men who was captured at Locust Grove was 18-year-old George Falconer. He was from Missouri, and he had started to keep a journal. And that journal was then captured, I guess you could say, by Albert Ellithorpe. And he used the little hardbound book to write his own journal entries in. Here's a flag that was captured at the Locust Grove skirmish. This is, again, this is a flag that's used in illustrations a great deal. And this is the cover of the book that I put together relating to Albert Ellithorpe. It's a collection of his writings, his journal, and newspaper articles he wrote for the Chicago Journal. Albert Ellithorpe often commented on how his native soldiers were so good at scouting. Keep in mind that in the border region, guerrilla warfare really became the main mode of warfare, and scouting would be an important element of that. Ellithorpe wrote in his journal that while scouting along the Verdigris River in July of 1862, he observed that the advance was cautiously made, and for over half an hour not a sound was heard. Here I saw the value of the Indian as a daring scout. In writing for his Chicago audience, he noted, his services as guide and upon scouts, and in the tracking out and destroying the bushwhacking gangs of this brush and jungle country, will furnish more instances of individual daring and cool bravery than can be evidenced from any other class of men. Ellithorpe often had very positive comments about the men in his unit. Ellithorpe also wrote about counterinsurgency actions. In other words, flushing out enemy guerrilla bands. For example, in January of 1863, Ellithorpe was part of a force made up of men of the 1st Indian Home Guards and men from Kansas unit. And they rode into Maysville, Arkansas, which is right on the border between Arkansas and the Indian Territory. He said that they were chasing about 15 to 20 Confederate guerrillas. He said that after they were discovered, after the enemy was discovered, he said, then the race began and we ran them into Maysville, killing 9 of them and taking 14 prisoners. I have thoroughly routed the whole gang. I like how he puts the attention on himself. There were certainly quite a few other men who ran those men into Maysville. He also wrote in January of 1863 about the actions of his men in the Ozarks of Northwest Arkansas. He said, this past week, we turned 500 of the Creek Indians loose into the mountains, hills, and gorges with instructions to hole every bushwhacker in range. The work has been accomplished, he assured his readers in Chicago. He also documented ambushes. He talked about how in early 1863, he and some other men in his regiment, along with some men in a Kansas unit, were ambushed in Southwest Missouri. And it turned into a very deadly action, resulting in 6 Union soldiers being killed and 6 wounded. Guerrilla warfare made up the bulk of the military actions that the 1st Indian Home Guard was involved in, but they also were involved in traditional battles too, such as the Battle of Prairie Grove on December 7th, 1862 in Arkansas. They were part of a group of regiments under the command of James Blunt, who reached the battle. The battle had been raging for quite some time. They entered the battlefield. And once the 1st Indian Home Guards arrived, they dismounted and then fought on foot. And according to Ellithorpe, the regiment fought well, as he put it, most of the time. I wish he'd gone into a little more detail about that and explained that a little more. In these traditional battles, it was absolutely critical that soldiers knew how to move around the battlefield effectively. And regular drill was the way to instill those lessons. Now, again, Ellithorpe tended to have very positive comments about his men. So even very early in their service, in the summer of '62, Ellithorpe wrote very positively about their drill. He said in a newspaper article, he said, you would be surprised to see our regiment move. They accomplish the feat of regular time equal to any white soldier. They form in line with dispatch and with great precision. And what is more, they now manifest a great desire to learn the entire white man's discipline in military matters. Now, that was his opinion. Colonel Robert Furness had a little bit different opinion. He actually resigned his commission as colonel of the regiment in September of 1862. He resigned primarily out of frustration. Here's a comment he wrote in his resignation letter. 5 months' connection with an Indian regiment only confirms me in the opinion that full-blood Indians cannot be made soldiers, and that to attempt it is a useless waste of both time and money. A bit later in the war, we get yet another observation, this one by Colonel William Phillips, who became the commander of the Indian Brigade in late 1862. This is what he wrote about the 1st Indian Home Guards in the spring of 1863. The 1st Indian Regiment, which I had almost despaired of after it was added to my command, is now being drilled and taught every day and is learning rapidly. They go through the common evolutions by company or battalion very credibly. Indeed, they did learn their lessons well, and they showed these very clearly at the next large battle that they served in, which was the Battle of Honey Springs, which was fought on July the 17th of 1863. Now, this is a very fanciful engraving. It appeared in Frank Leslie's illustrated newspaper. It was drawn by James O'Neill, who was traveling with the Army. And so he actually was an eyewitness at the Battle of Honey Springs. But this is a little, probably a bit overly dramatic. James Blunt was the Union commander at the Battle of Honey Springs. He was closely associated with the 1st Indian Guards for part of their service. And here's a map showing troop movements and positions at the Battle of Honey Springs. Honey Springs, the location of the battle, is now a state historical park in Oklahoma. It's situated near Shakota and is well worth a visit. At this battle, General Blunt, for reasons that I've never quite been able to determine, took the Indian Brigade and divided the regiment, so they did not serve as a group. So he divided them across the Union line. 1st Indian Home Guard was on close to the left flank of the Union position. When Union troops were advancing toward the Confederate line, they at first advanced in what we call column, and then they maneuvered so they were then in line, and you can see them in line here. Moving from column into line sometimes takes quite a while, sometimes took a while on Civil War battlefields, but according to Blunt, each of the regiments performed that maneuver very quickly, including the 1st Indian Home Guard. So that shows that they were well drilled and had quite a bit of prowess now in those kinds of maneuvers. The 1st Indian Home Guard was situated by the 6th Kansas Cavalry, and by all accounts, they performed very well at this battle. So you can see a quote from their commanding officer, Stephen Waddles, describing how they advanced under destructive fire from the enemy. After hard fighting, gained a position in the timber, and finally drove the enemy across the stream on the left of the bridge, the enemy forming several times and desperately contesting every foot of ground. The commanding officer of the 6th Kansas Cavalry next to them described their charge as gallant. Reported casualties at Honey Springs for the 1st Indian Home Guards was 2 killed and 6 wounded. Something to keep in mind is that these Indian Home Guard units always consistently underreported their number of wounded. Apparently, it was a point of pride among Indian soldiers to not report a wound unless it was exceptionally serious. After the Battle of Honey Springs, the regiment basically settled in around Fort Gibson, which had been renamed Fort Blunt. Fort Gibson is in the northeast part of the Indian Territory. And they basically engaged in a number of skirmishes and guerrilla warfare from that point on in the war. At this point, I'm going to kind of change to a little bit different subject. Throughout the service, these Indian soldiers exerted their power in certain ways, and we use the word agency kind of as a synonym for power here. Indian soldiers were often granted a leeway that was really seldom given or allowed for Caucasian soldiers. Keep in mind the Army had used scouts, Indian scouts, for a number of years. They had learned a lot about how to relate with Indian soldiers and had learned quite a bit about their culture. So I'll give you some examples of this. One relates to weapons. Indian soldiers often used their guns as personal weapons, and they tended to do quite a bit of hunting with them. Eventually, the soldiers of the first Indian Home Guards used so many bullets that it became difficult to resupply them. And in this case, the US Army started docking their pay. And by doing that, they were able to force these soldiers to kind of cut back on some of their personal hunting with these weapons. Another example has to do with absences without leave. Going AWOL. If a Caucasian soldier was absent without leave, they could be subject to execution. Soldiers in the first Indian Home Guards often absented themselves without leave. They would simply go home for a while to their families. Sometimes they would be gone for several months at a time. The US Army did not execute any of these soldiers. Instead, they would basically dock their pay. And it should be pointed out that many of these soldiers did return voluntarily to the ranks. Now, sometimes that was due to an amnesty proclamation. So they would often return voluntarily, and they would have experienced a loss of pay for the time period that they were actually absent. Another accommodation had to do with burial. Usually Civil War soldiers would not be buried with their equipment. But Native soldiers believed that this equipment could be used in the afterlife. So the US Army allowed men of the Indian Home Guards to be buried with their military equipment and their personal effects. It should be noted that there were some problem areas relating to these Indian Home Guard units. A major problem area related to language. It was very challenging for white officers in this regiment to communicate with enlisted men. The white officers did not know native languages. Many of the enlisted men did not know English. This problem was one of the major reasons why Colonel Furness resigned his commission in this regiment. He stated in his resignation letter that there was only one company officer and only a handful of enlisted men who knew any English. And he pointed out that commands had to be conveyed via the African creeks. Furness wrote that he had but little assurance that orders are correctly given and none that they are understood or appreciated. Now, it seems to me from Albert Ellithorpe's writings and from some other sources that eventually these men did learn how to communicate somehow with each other. Actually, a more significant issue had to do with racism. This was certainly a time period with a great deal of racism pertaining to Native Americans and certainly to African Americans. And this racism made the men of the first Indian Home Guards and the other Home Guards units a lot more vulnerable to attempts to cheat them and defraud them. Albert Ellithorpe uncovered two of these schemes in November of 1862, where two officers in his unit were defrauding the men. One of these men was First Lieutenant George Dobler. He had persuaded several Indians in his company to answer present to the names of men who were either dead or absent without leave. When these men collected the pay, which amounted to about $90, they handed that over to First Lieutenant Dobler. He was cashiered and removed from the service. The other scheme that Ellithorpe uncovered related to Lieutenant Colonel Stephen Waddles. Waddles was pocketing pay that was actually intended for several of the African Creeks. He was also drawing pay for his personal servant, and this all amounted to $666.64, which in today's money, that would be about $10,000. Waddles was arrested, but he was reinstated when he repaid the money. Albert Ellithorpe, in his private journal, said that Waddles was like quite a few men he encountered in the Army. He had this to say. He said Waddles was similar to men who, quote, follow the Army for the sole purpose of money and profit. They have no patriotism, no love of country, no thoughts for the future good of the nation, but only self, money, money. And Ellithorpe underlined money in his journal. Stephen Waddles was really an underhanded kind of character. He somehow managed to stay in command of the regiment for much of the war, but near the end of the conflict, he was being investigated for the theft of an army wagon. So how he was able to maintain command was one of the mysteries. When the war ended, casualties were tabulated. This is a chart that was put together by Chris Rain. He wrote a very interesting article about the first Indian Home Guards that appeared in Kansas History a few years ago. Chris Rain has also recently had a book published about the 2nd Colorado Cavalry, and that's a very interesting read. You'll see that 425 men of the first Indian Home Guards died during the Civil War. That's out of a total enrollment of 1,773. And almost all Civil War regiments had more men die of disease than of combat wounds. And that's certainly true in the first Indian Home Guards. This is very interesting. You'll see that 178 men in this regiment died of smallpox. We don't often think of smallpox as being a significant killer in the mid-19th century. But Native soldiers were very vulnerable to smallpox. They essentially had no immunity to the disease. The first cases of smallpox were discovered in the regiment in the spring of 1863. There were quarantine areas that were set up. There were attempts made to inoculate men. But by the end of 1863, there was a full-blown epidemic around Fort Gibson. And this affected all of the Indian Home Guard units, and it also affected apparently quite a large number of civilians who were living in the area too. According to some accounts, there were some men who committed suicide rather than wait for smallpox to kill them. You'll see that 193 other men died of various other diseases, some of which we don't really know what disease they died of. 40 died of combat. 8 were murdered. You have 6 accidental deaths, and then 54 other deaths, non-disease. Have no idea. We don't know what the stories are with that. When the war ended in 1865, Reconstruction started. Many people associate Reconstruction with the southern states, or rather the former states of the Confederacy. But Reconstruction also impacted the Indian Territory too. The federal government forced each of the 5 tribes to sign Reconstruction treaties. And basically, in these treaties, they were required to give up some of their lands. This was basically a punishment for the fact that the 5 tribes had all allied with the Confederacy. Now, when these lands were surrendered, the federal government would eventually move some of the Plains Indians tribes into the Indian Territory to settle on those lands that had been surrendered. And of course, later in time, you get land runs that take place on some of those lands, and land lotteries and other things. Actually, the service of these Indian Home Guard units actually helped mitigate some of the land losses. Initially, the federal government had plans to take, X amount of land from each of the tribes. But then when the federal government was reminded of the service of the Indian Home Guard units, that helped mitigate some of these losses. And so the federal government backed off on that, and the land losses would be less as a result. Unfortunately, the vulnerability of these soldiers because of racism continued into the Reconstruction era. This is a document I came across while I was doing research. This is a government report that was published in 1872, titled Alleged Frauds Against Certain Indian Soldiers, basically against Indian Home Guard veterans. This report is about 600 pages. And in it, it outlines these alleged frauds. And I'll tell you the basic story. In 1865, the Interior Department authorized an attorney named John W. Wright to go into the Indian Territory to investigate various pension claims made by veterans of the Indian Home Guard units, as well as widows, and also to investigate claims for bounty money. Some Civil War soldiers were given bounty payments. So Wright went into the Indian Territory, and eventually the Interior Department started receiving complaints about the activities of John Wright and his various associates. In 1867, it was learned that there had hardly been any money paid out by Wright, and widows and a number of veterans were complaining that Wright was encouraging them to accept not direct payments, but instead to accept goods from Fort Gibson at inflated prices. I also found a part in here where Creek Negroes were told that they were ineligible for a second bounty payment, as that would go to their former masters. And it's like, what about emancipation? But so that was an interesting statement. The report documented that Wright had misappropriated a great deal of money. The report states that it was difficult to determine exactly how much he had misappropriated because his record keeping was so horrible. But they documented that at least $187,000 and possibly much more had been misappropriated by Wright. And in terms of today's money, that would be several $1 million. I really don't know the outcome of this investigation. I was a little unclear after looking through this report. So more research would be needed to determine what was the actual outcome of this investigation. In the early 20th century, there were several monuments erected on the old courthouse square in Tahlequah in the Indian Territory. And these were monuments erected in honor of the service of Confederate Cherokee soldiers. And what's fascinating to me is that, as far as I know, none of the 5 tribes ever erected a monument in memory of the service of the Indian Home Guard soldiers. So it is that the men who served in the first Indian Home Guards, they lie today in peaceful grave sites that mostly range across northeast Oklahoma. Some of these men have grave markers that designate their service in the first Indian Home Guards. Others have simple markers on their graves. Other graves are completely forgotten. They died of smallpox and the effects of bullet wounds. But I would say most of them passed away of natural causes in the post-war period. Some lived to ripe old ages and perhaps told their children and grandchildren of their experiences in that long ago war. And perhaps some would have agreed with a reflection made by one of their former Army officers, Albert Ellithorpe. And I'll end the presentation by reading his reflection. Ellithorpe, by the way, was very proud of his service in the first Indian Home Guards. He said he was proud of having shared in all the rough and tumble experience of those terrible years on the frontier, a kind of experience which was so entirely different from that of the armies in other parts of the country, so much more wild, exciting, and critical that none but those actually under Blunt's command can appreciate its character. If the detailed history of that army of the frontier could be fully and faithfully written, it would be one of the most thrilling narratives of peril, bravery, self-sacrificing endurance under hardship, bloody encounters, and bold and daring deeds that mark the annals of modern warfare. Thank you all for your attention, and I hope you enjoyed this presentation.
Very much so. Thank you, Jane. We have a number of questions. I do want to say that just hearing Ellithorpe's words, it made me think that you were actually able to capture that for him in your book through presenting his words and your own to bring light to this very often misunderstood or not read about as much as it should be. So thank you so much.
You're welcome. It's been fun.
Well, we have a number of questions, and the first one is, was Jim Lane involved in this activity?
Jim Lane was a very strong proponent of recruiting the Indian regiments. So I would say he was a very strong political supporter, but he was not, I would say he was not so much like right there on the field helping to recruit these soldiers. He was more kind of behind the scenes, kind of pushing the Lincoln administration to do this.
Well, we often talk about Jim Lane as having the first Kansas Colored Regiment as the first Black soldiers. So is it the Home Guard or is it Jim Lane?
I'm not sure I understand your question.
Oh, well, you mentioned that the first African-American soldiers in the Army were in the Indian Home Guard. Jim Lane claims that he organized the first African-American soldiers.
Yes, that's true. But actually, the African Creeks and the first Indian Home Guard were actually mustered first. And then the first Kansas Colored came along a bit later.
See, now that's a piece of history that has been lost, I think, because James Lane promoted it the other way.
Yes, probably so.
Probably so.
He was good at that.
Were the Africans former slaves of certain Native Americans?
All of the 5 tribes had enslaved peoples. That's a fact that not many people know. So each of the 5 tribes had African slaves, but the form of slavery in the Indian Territory was not quite what it was in the southern states. Apparently, slaves in the Indian Territory were allowed quite a bit more leeway. They were given, I hate to say this, a little more freedom than a slave, say, in Mississippi, for example. And they kind of had somewhat different roles. So the role of interpreter was a very significant role for many of the enslaved peoples in the Indian Territory. So it's possible that in the first Indian Home Guards that some of these African Creeks may have been serving in the regiment alongside former masters.
Following the war, did the natives return to Indian Territory and were they given land? And you addressed this a little bit.
They did return to the Indian Territory. In fact, many of them did return after the Union victory at the Battle of Honey Springs in July of 1863. Many of the people who returned kind of apparently around Fort Gibson, it was just kind of a pretty massive camp with a number of civilians there. And once the war ended, then peoples were able to spread out even more and really get back to their farms. They really were not granted any additional land, though, in the post-war period.
What was the pay for the Indian Home Guards compared to African American and white troops?
The Indians were paid, their pay was just like the pay of white soldiers. That was something that surprised me too when I did the research. Pay, as I'm sure many of you know, for African American soldiers was less until Congress changed that later in the war.
Right. And they even held back some of that for uniforms.
That's exactly right. But the Indian soldiers were paid just like the whites.
Okay. Did any Indian Home Guard members engage in scalping, and were they allowed to do so?
I have never seen any account of that. I've never seen the only stories I've heard about scalping would be the Confederate Cherokees possibly scalping Union soldiers at Pea Ridge. But I've never heard any accounts of any of the Indian Home Guard soldiers doing that.
Jane, I might have you close your PowerPoint so that people
yes.
can see you better. And that will give me more time to read.
I am seeing if I can do that. I may need technical assistance.
Oh, there we go. Okay.
Thank you.
Trey. Yeah. After the work, were African Creeks living on reservations, or did they separate themselves from the Creeks?
I'm not sure I have an exact answer to that. After the Civil War, I would say in the late 19th century, there were quite a few all Black towns that were created in the Indian Territory and later in Oklahoma. So I'm not aware of anyone who's really traced what these former enslaved peoples, where they exactly went after the war. I imagine some of them returned to places they were familiar with in the Indian Territory and somehow acquired land. But I don't really have an exact answer for that.
Okay, I'm moving on. I've lost the question here. Oh, did the members of the Indian Home Guard do things other Union soldiers did after the war, like the GAR? Was there a GAR unit just for the Indian Home Guard? This is like a senior thesis.
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. I cannot think of a particular GAR camp offhand that was made up predominantly of Native Americans. I'll have to investigate that and see what I can find out. I appreciate that question.
Wendy Morton says, fascinating information. Thank you, Dr. Johansson and the Kansas State Historical Society. Well, thank you. We have another thank you from Jan Burant, and then from Lee Starks. Do you have any specific information on Company G of the Indian Home Guards?
I do not. I would have to do a little research. I'm not aware that their service would have been any different than any of the other companies. I'm trying to think. It's possible I have on my computer some digitized scans of a muster roll relating to them. And if I could look into that later, and if I have it, I'd be glad to email it to you.
Okay, we'll keep track of this writer and try and give him the answer he's looking for. We have a question, was this taped so we can review it online? And yes, it is recorded. And did any of the soldiers assigned to Fort Leavenworth serve with the Indians of the First Guard?
I don't believe so.
Okay. And then we have some commentary from Kim Lebrecht, and she said, thank you for addressing the racism against the indigenous and the freedmen, which goes far beyond Waddell's theft. And why would the white officers not trust the Black Muscogees to translate well? Why did none of those officers work to learn the language?
Unfortunately, the only primary account we have, or I should say in the form of a diary, is the one kept by Ellithorpe. So unfortunately, there are a lot of details about that we just simply don't know. As for Ellithorpe, in a post-war account, he claimed that he had learned part of the Cherokee language before the Civil War. Now, he tended to, in my opinion, in the post-war period, he tended to kind of get into these old soldier stories where he tended to exaggerate things. So I don't know if that was really quite true or not, but it is possible that some of these white officers picked up some of the Muscogee Creek language. The Seminole language is very similar.
But it wasn't required of them.
It was not
Right.
required. No, it was not.
She had one more comment that she hoped you would address the numbers of Cherokee who defected from the Confederate Army upon meeting the Indian Home Guards on the field of battle. And I think we'll end with that question.
Well, that's a really interesting question, because after the Union victory at Locust Grove, there was a small group of Union cavalrymen who were dispatched to Tahlequah, which was the capital of the Cherokee Nation. And Chief John Ross of the Cherokee, he was not in favor of the alliance with the Confederacy for various reasons. And so when these cavalrymen got to Tahlequah and to Park Hill, where he resided, he surrendered to these Union cavalrymen, and the Ross family left the Cherokee Nation and went to Philadelphia. So he was kind of a chief in exile, so to speak. And after Locust Grove as well, there was a Confederate cavalry unit who almost en masse went to the Union side. And those men went into the 2nd and 3rd Indian Home Guard units.
Yeah.
That's the only instance we know of in the Civil War where we had a regiment who basically en masse defected to the other side.
It's a story we don't hear very often.
No.
Well, to everyone who has enjoyed tonight's program, I highly recommend you get the book. And unfortunately, we do not sell it in our gift shop. We should, but I'm sure there are many ways to get it from you. It's a 2016 publication, and it is a very insightful read. I love how you summarize at the beginning of each chapter and then let Ellithorpe use his own words in his letters to tell it in his own language, which is, it's a struggle sometime to read because it's more floral, or you have to read between the lines, but a wonderful job. Thank you so much. We've enjoyed having you.
It's been wonderful. Thank you for having me.
Well, thank you all for joining us tonight, and I hope you have enjoyed the presentation as much as I know I have, and we'll log in again next year on Friday, January 8th. Yes, 2020 will be over soon for the presentation, Hispano-Capitalistas de Nuevo Mexico on the Santa Fe Trail. Historian Dr. Gene Chavez will share his insights about trade on the trail, and the timing of this talk is not accidental. 2021 marks the 200th anniversary of this international commercial trail between the US and Mexico. As you know, all our programs are free, but donations are always welcome. And you can donate on our website by clicking on the shop link on the homepage. Be sure to have a safe and happy holiday season. Happy Hanukkah and Merry Christmas. And from all of us at Museum After Hours, good night.